I've been around the fire and rescue service for over 2 decades, but there's one area I know less about, and that's the on-call system. Why would someone devote hours of their free time to train to respond to fires, agree to be on-call should a fire break out, and then be willing to drop everything to attend that fire, even if they're at work at their day job? They need a sympathetic employer and an equally sympathetic family to do this important role. I've heard that it's hard to get high levels of availability, but there are challenges with recruitment and retention. But what does this all mean? Mid and West Wales Fire and Rescue Service is a good place to look when we want to understand how the on-call system works. With 56 fire stations across a huge geographical expanse, its risks are as diverse as its landscape. I spent time last summer in this part of Wales, and it is beautiful. I'm Catherine Levin, editor of Emergency Services Times, and in this episode of For Every Response, I talked to Craig Flannery, the Chief Fire Officer for Mid and West Wales. He is steeped in this service, joining in 2002 and working his way up to the top role last year. With 52 out of 56 stations having on-call firefighters, he knows well how this system works and what challenges it faces. We talk about recruitment, retention, flooding, wildfires, and the importance of community. We kick off this conversation by finding out more about his part of the world.
Mid and West Wales Fire and Rescue Service actually covers 2/3 of the landmass of Wales. I think it's the third largest geographic fire and rescue service in the UK. So we've got Powys, which is quite a big local authority area, and right at the top of there, a place called Llanfachlin, all the way down the coast, Aberystwyth, down to Milford Haven and Pembroke Dock, and then across Tenby. People have probably heard about that area into Carmarthenshire, Neath, Talbot and Swansea. So that's the 6 local authority areas that Mid and West Wales covers. About 56 stations across that whole area. And I think one of the reasons why we're so lucky here is that we have such a diversity and broad range of risk. So we've got the refineries in Milford and Pembroke, power stations down there as well. We've got industrial in Port Talbot and Llanelli in different areas. But we've also got, as you just mentioned, Catherine, Aberystwyth, the university town, and Swansea, another university town, but a city, So, we've got a huge variety of risk, and we cover a huge area. And with that huge area comes quite a big rural aspect to it as well. So in true fire service tradition, it is about us trying to be everything to everyone. We've got across the whole kind of prevention, protection and response arrangements.
So with such a diverse area and the geography, that's a lot of square miles, I imagine, across that. You have to find the people to actually come and be part of your fire service. And so one of the reasons to speak to you today was very much about the on-call firefighting system, because you don't have lots of towns in there. So how are you able to crew your fire stations with people whose main job isn't fighting fires? What is an on-call firefighter?
Okay, that's a really good question. What's an on-call firefighter? I think the first thing I would say is on-call firefighters, they'll have some common similarities, but then it's very nuanced to those areas that they're in. So on-call firefighters, as you've just said, are people that are engaged with us on a part-time basis. Historically, Mid and West Wales has always been pretty much an on-call service. We've got 56 stations, of which 52 of them have an on-call complement. And 43 stations are actually standalone on-call. So very heavily reliant upon our on-call duty system and those people that serve us in that regard. In terms of what an on-call firefighter is, this is pretty much in terms of when the call comes in, the pager goes off, they will get to the fire station as quick as they can and jump out on the fire engine and go out. That is, it's in basic sense from an operational standpoint. They'll have a primary job or do other things. We are pretty much a secondary, but they still undertake a vast amount of training with us. And once a week, they will come in, certainly Mid and West, on a certain night to train for 2 to 3 hours. So, being attached to a pager, not necessarily being able to go out of the village, a lot of personal sacrifice attached to that. family sacrifices attached to it. A number of my colleagues have told me quite often that when the firefighters respond to emergencies, that the family members are left behind, or wherever or whoever that is, left in supermarkets or birthday parties and all kinds of stuff. So the incredible people in terms of giving up that personal sacrifice. And I think just going on, so those are some of the common similarities, that altruistic calling, that community calling. I mean, on-call firefighters being in the heart of some of these communities are absolutely the pillars of resilience. And what I would say in that regard, the differences then will be determined about what stations they're at. So some of my on-call stations have got specialist skill sets, whether that's in relation to floodwater. So in Wales, a bit different to in England. In Wales, we've got statutory responsibility for floodwater and rescues that in that regard. So a number of my on-call teams are wading teams. Some of them are large animal rescue stations to be able to assist in the agricultural environment. You tend to find people put themselves at harm's risk when they're trying to rescue large animals and things like that. So I think my on-call firefighters across the rural Wales and also then the city areas tend to be core trained, but with specialisms that are much needed by their local communities.
Oh, there's quite a few things to pick up on that. Just to take you back to the original, when you talked about the risk, you talked about refineries, power stations, industry. Are the on-call firefighters attending fires in those quite tricky risk environments?
Yeah, thankfully, we don't get too many of those incidents. I'm pleased to say, and touch wood, that continues. But so down in West Wales, where we've got stations such as Haverfordwest, Pembroke Dock and Milford Haven, not only have we got whole-time members of staff in those stations, we've also got on-call complements as well. And what's really interesting, Catherine, is we always talk about on-call staff as bringing transferable skill sets in. And indeed, certainly in some of those stations, we've actually got staff members from those refineries undertaking a contract with us for firefighting. So there'll be firefighters in the refinery as well as on-call firefighters with us as well. So they bring that experience of those risk areas with them too. So yeah, my on-call firefighters don't just cover kind of rural areas and agriculture areas. They're covering city areas, they're covering petrochem, industrial areas as well. And they train to that risk. So that's the other thing. It's really worth mentioning to you. So, for example, Fishguard. Fishguard is a fairly rural on-call station right on the coast. And you may have heard that, there's a port there. We have ferry crossings. So that on-call station, as well as doing core skills, will have competencies attached to alongside ship firefighting, which is also a statutory responsibility for us as well.
Yeah, so that makes sense. And also sort of doesn't help with my next question, which was going to be about what is the typical on-call firefighter? And it's quite clear from what you've just said that there isn't one. And that the commonality is what you call the community calling, that's the thing that drives them, but actually their jobs, very specific depending on exactly where they are. I'm quite surprised by that and how diverse the risks are that you talk about. But I'm interested in some concept of the pillars of resilience. So would you say that is a fire generally comment, or is that specific to the call cadre in terms of pillars of resilience? What did you mean by that?
So I'll just take a random on-call station. So Llanuted Wells, which for Yorkshireman, it's hard to say it properly, but I hope I've not been too far off. Been 30 years in Wales now. So Llanuted Wells is in the heart of Powys. It's on the main trunk road going north to south. And Llanuted Wells on call, as an example now, got a small little fire station there. They've got a medical response team there as well that they've co-responded since 1998. They're one of the first stations to undertake fire medical response. But also during inclement weather, they're the first ones to assist with health visitors visiting those at most, high vulnerability, those at most need. And during COVID, they were driving ambulances and doing vaccinations. So when they talk about on call, especially in those rural areas where there's probably not much resource in that area, then they are heavily relied upon, not just for what we do from a fire and rescue perspective, but for other things that generally would probably fall outside the scope of fire and rescue service. We've got huge can-do attitude, as all my staff have. But I think in those rural areas, when there's not much else around, they're really relied really heavily upon. And so that's just an example of a couple of years ago, I remember really bad snow up there, and they used their 4x4 to help the health visitors get around to those elderly and vulnerable people.
And so thinking about your fish guard team that you talked about just now, would they be working very closely perhaps with the RNLI and the Coast Guard to create these pillars of resilience within that community, because it's very specific to being on the coast, certain types of risk? Does it work in that way as well?
Yeah, it does. And whether it's Fishguard with the RNLI or whether it's Brecon. So Brecon is another on-call station in the heart of the Brecon Beacons. It's a 2-pump station. They've also got a wildfire unit there in ATV because they get a lot of wildfires up that neck of the woods. But as an example for Brecon, they do a lot of close collaboration work with the Mountain Rescue. So Brecon Mountain Rescue HQ isn't far from the fire station. And so in relation to waterborne exercises and attending incidents, they will work really collaboratively together for the benefit of their community. So whether it's Mountain Rescue, whether it's RNLI, whether it's the traditional blue light collaboration, but also we work across the piece. Here in Wales, there is this kind of one public service approach. So we're able, as a devolved administration and devolved fire and rescue service, I feel there's less red tape. We're able to work better across partners. And there is a piece of legislation that's in Wales that's nowhere else that we know of, and it's called the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which enables perhaps a little bit more partnership and collaborative work.
You mentioned flooding just now, and you made the point that in Wales it's a statutory duty, England being the only one of the nations that doesn't have it as a statutory duty. In terms of the number of flooding incidents that you're going to now as a service, is that rising? Is that changing for you?
Yeah, I mean, I can't give you the exact figures, but I can definitely tell you it's rising. It's very seasonal, as you'd expect, So this year we have had significant amount of floodwater rescues. And just last November, there was a major incident in a place called Whitland, which is an on-call area. A care residential home was becoming, the floodwaters were rising very, very quickly inside, and we had to evacuate very quickly to get those vulnerable people out. I think what it's fair to say is that those 1 in 100-year events are becoming less of 100 years, and so on and so forth. So we work really closely with National Resources Wales, which is your equivalent to the Environment Agency, to look at modelling, to look at the preparedness piece. Because that's one thing that we could export quite a lot of is water here in Wales. It's we do get our fair share of rainwater and runoff, and that's probably why you see the evolution of fire and rescue service here in Wales. Going back probably 15 years ago, we had the odd boat, and that was about it. And we trained people to RYA level 2. Now, fast forward, we've got 6 swiftwater rescue teams with boats here in Mid and West, and across 39 stations, we've got a wading response as well. So certainly over the last 15 years, when you look at the evolution of the fire and rescue service, and you look at the changes that have been made by staff and management to be able to equip our people to deal with those incidents, there's an awful lot being done.
So the skills of the on-call firefighter are evolving with that. So more of them having to have this flood response skill and the training that you talked about earlier. And in fact, having 6 swift water teams, how much has that changed? What sort of period have you gone up to that 6 number? Is that in recent times, or is that over a long period of time?
I think we've had 6 for quite a while. So our new Community Risk Management Plan 2040, so it's a CRMP that other fire and rescue services will be familiar with, but ours goes a little bit further into the future, 2040. And part of that process and that consultation is running what we call balance rooms. So this is where we bring together our subject matter experts from within service. We'll bring people like you've just mentioned, Catherine, the RNLI, Mountain Rescue. We'll bring NRW into that, National Resources Wales. And basically, we look at the data, we look at the intelligence, and we look at the offering and provision, and we explore what else could we be doing in terms of not just from a response perspective, but from a preventative perspective as well. So we've just recently undertaken 3 flooding balance rooms to have a look at that provision. I haven't seen the report yet, but certainly over the next couple of months when that report comes out, I would expect us that it would give us a series of options to increase our capability further, but also to enhance our stakeholder engagement. So what else can we be doing with other services? As I've just mentioned to you, the collaborations that we can strengthen our approach for the communities. So definitely more significant incidents, definitely more major incidents being declared from a floodwater perspective. And yeah, we're increasing capability to meet that need.
I've never heard of a balance room before. So is that effectively like, trying to think, maybe like a local resilience forum, bringing everybody together to do a sort of a desktop exercise? Or is it trying to sort of relate it to something that I know? Could you just explain a little bit more about how it works, where the ideas come from?
Yeah, so a couple of years ago, the Deputy Chief Fire Officer, Ewan Cray, whose remit is strategic planning, he looked at what other organisations outside of fire service had, and recognising that quite often I think we can sometimes hide behind short-termism in terms of annual budget cycles and things like that. And Ewan really wanted to push ahead and start addressing some of the big issues that we know we'll be facing in the future. The output of that was this new and bold CRMP 2040. But what's absolutely key and fundamental to this new approach is how we consult with not just our own people here in service, but our communities as well. And so the balance room, in essence, is a multitude of different stakeholders getting together around a table or a room, having the data, having the intelligence presented in, and basically asking what is the art of the possible here? What is the want? What is the desire? What is the need to ensure that everybody's kind of diverse voice from around the table is heard? So unions will be involved, trade unions are involved, our staff, our subject matter experts, some of our stations that would have swift water rescue and wading capability, our partner agencies such as NRW, Mountain Rescue, RNLI, and along with members of the public. It is very much, when it comes to flooding, I did a bit of work a few years ago with a community action group called the Knighton Flood Group. And nobody knew their risk better than those people in that community. And in fact, I had an 80-year-old lady turn up to the fire station for a bit of a meeting that I held with them to tell me about her own lived experience of flooding and what it meant for her to have to be carried out of the house when the rainwaters came in. And very humbling. And at the same time, recognizing that if they hadn't come forward, we wouldn't have had such a rich understanding of their risk in Knighton. So these balance rooms are on the same principle, recognizing that it's, if we're going to engage with our stakeholders about our provision for the future, how better to engage them than right at the start with the information, with the intelligence that we have to co-create what that kind of future capability and look and feel looks like.
We hear a lot about engaging with stakeholders. It's kind of a phrase, but when you set it out like that very kind of hyper-local lived experience from somebody who suffers every time there's a flood, and understanding it and using that to really understand how you can put in your measures to prevent and then respond. I think that's really interesting to hear you talk about that. I wonder if we can go to the other end of the spectrum, which is wildfires. So in terms of changing climate risk, what are you seeing in Mid and West Wales in terms of change when it comes to very hot, dry periods? And how are you changing your response, and in particular your on-call firefighter experience as a result of that?
So again, I'll just kind of revert back to the CRMP 2040 balance rooms, which we've completed the wildfire balance room a couple of months ago, because in readiness to come into wildfire season. And there was a series of options on the back of that, which was about working more collaborative with land management teams and landowners. Again, going back to the Deputy Chief, he set up the Wales Wildfire Board, which in essence was bringing all those stakeholders together because, as I've already said, in Wales, high area of rurality, a lot of farming goes on. So bringing those land management teams and those landowners into the equation when we're talking about what does a control burn look like and how can we ensure that we can support that. And learning from other services where they've got burn back teams. We haven't got a burn back team in Mid and West, but South Wales have. And so it is about not just increasing capability, but it's also about bringing more awareness and education. And I guess in a nutshell, having more meaningful dialogue with people that would like to see things burn off to enable the new growth to come through versus our kind of stake in that, which is, if it's controlled and there's no properties close by or forests of, scientific, interest areas, then, we can help with this, a more joined up understanding and more mutual understanding and respect. So, yeah, from a wildfire perspective, we are moving much more into that kind of negotiated discussion phase with those people. And at the same time, as I just mentioned to you, building our capabilities for when things do go wrong and when we do get wildfire. So, for example, now having more all-terrain vehicles to be able to access some of these areas, working with NRW for the provision of helicopter coverage. So using helicopters as a means to extinguish the fire, using what we call eye cutters to cut fire breaks in readiness for, it's very much a preventative first approach, but also making sure that when we are required, we've got the capabilities, the training, the tools and the equipment to be able to deal with it.
So I asked you about the on-call firefighter. So if I'm working in my job and I get called out to deal with wildfire, I've got a period of time which I'm available. Then I've got to go back to my normal job. So wildfires can last for a long period of time and can see crews out for very long periods. So how do you marry up the availability of your on-call with the duration of an incident like a wildfire that could go on for days? How do you manage that in terms of resourcing it?
Yeah, no, interesting question. And it's something that when we do get those kind of major incidents or significant fires, it's really important that we wrap welfare support in and around that in terms of, not just on call, but whole time as well. After a certain period of time, we want to swap the crews out, really heavily reliant on our fire control with standby moves and those welfare swapping out arrangements as well. And I think it also goes down to some of the equipment we've got, Catherine, as well. So high volume pumps, the all-terrain vehicles, the wildfire brake cutters as well. It's about pulling all that into play. But ultimately, it's also from an on-call perspective about working with the primary employers as an example. So we're really lucky that on-call are very established here in Wales, and we've got a great relationship with employers who release the on-call to come and attend these type of fires. And we do employer recognition programs. We do employer and family recognition days on stations every year. We make them feel part and parcel of that response family so that when they are having to take the hit on an on-call firefighter being out for 2 or 3 hours, they know it's for a really good reason. I think the other thing that we've always benefited from is that the skills that we give to our on-call, whether that is first aid or critical incident management or decision-making processes, again, can transfer into that primary employment as well. So it's not just skills that they're bringing into the fire service, but it's the skills that we're giving them to take back into their primary employment as well. So it's a relationship, and it's a relationship where I would say over the last couple of years, we've started to get better at it. I think we lost our way a little bit with the employers. I won't say we took it for granted, but it became the norm, and we've had to work really hard again to work with employers to get them to understand that the sacrifices often that the employers are making are for the benefit of those communities as well. And probably one final thing I'll mention on this, because it's a really good point, is that we're working with Welsh Government at the moment. So over the last 6 to 9 months, I've been working with the other 2 fire services in Wales, with the Welsh Government Fire Branch, to understand what more help Welsh Government at a national level here in Wales can give to us as 3 FRSs. So there's been some national research published last November by the NFCC, commissioned by MAHCLG, and that was published last November, which talked about sustaining the on-call. It talked about some of the challenges and some of the barriers and some of the pressures there. But a series of recommendations came out on the back of that report. And I guess what I've done here in Wales is worked with Welsh Government to better understand that and how can they help instead of it all being local level driven, how can they work from a national perspective and drive some of those recommendations forward.
This episode of the Emergency Services Times podcast is sponsored by MSA Safety, proudly supporting emergency services and first responders on the front line. At MSA Safety, protecting first responders isn't just what we do, it's who we are. We work closely with fire and rescue services across the UK to develop and deliver safety solutions designed to meet your ever-evolving needs. That includes MSA Bristol Firefighter PPE, trusted by services across the UK and beyond, shaped through years of collaboration with frontline teams. It also includes our growing investment in innovation and technology, from the connected M1 SCBA modular solution to our agile, fully managed service model that helps keep crews protected and ready to respond. But for us, safety goes beyond equipment. We believe in standing shoulder to shoulder with the people who dedicate their lives to protecting others, whether it's supporting firefighter charities, backing mental health initiatives, or showing up for community events. MSA is proud to be part of the emergency services family. To learn more about our work in the UK and how we're supporting first responders every step of the way, visit www.msasafety.com. With MSA Safety, when you go in, we go in with you.
We've talked about the world in which they're working. We've talked about the risks. We've talked about the sort of national view and this one public service approach that you take in Wales. But at the end of the day, you need people to want to give up their time, their employers to be supportive in the way that you've described. Do you have enough on-call firefighters now? And if you don't, how are you going about recruiting them into this changed world and keeping them for the long term once you've trained and developed them?
So we can always have more. Absolutely. We've got vacancies, and I think that's endemic across the whole sector, is you'll always see on-call vacancies because they are the highest kind of turnover rate. But similarly, I was talking to a colleague this morning in Paris, the chief exec, and I was talking about some of the on-call firefighters up there who have got 42 and 43 years of service in. So, you know, we've got some long-standing members, and we've got people that are coming in to the front end. The trick is, how do we hold on to them? You know, we'll keep recruiting, but how do we hold on to them? And I think over the last 2 years here in Mid and West, it's the first time in a long time that we've actually had more people starting than leaving. So if I can talk about retention first, I think retention, what we've found here in Mid and West is, it is about that kind of recognition piece, recognizing that they are sacrificing a hell of a lot to keep the pumps on the run and keep the community safe. It's about listening to their voice. You know, we started an on-call improvement program 3 years ago, which specifically looked at the evidence and data that was out there. So Shropshire did a piece of work back in 2021 by Dr. Steve Sadler. He's an on-call firefighter that's worked across 4 different services. And we used his research to underpin our improvement program. Our improvement program then was very much a case of trying to streamline some processes, surfacing their on-call voice in terms of that recognition piece, about drills, about training and competencies, and working through those improvements then, those local-led changes, so that 1, they felt their voice was being heard, and 2, they recognized we're trying to help them help us help their community. So, you know, I think we're performing quite well here in Wales, in Mid and West from an on-call availability perspective, but there's much more work to be done in that regard. I think the other thing that's helpful is that, so a couple of people from across the border. So Steve Healy, the Deputy of Lancashire, has been absolutely kind of leading the charge for the on-call at a national level. About 3 years ago, the National On-Call Group stood back up. And I think under Steve's leadership, supported by Andy Cole and a few others on that strategic board, we've been able to really put on-call back on the national agenda, because I think it fell off. And it just shows the art of the possible. Once you put it back on the agenda and you put some focused energy into it, like we've done here in Mid and West, our on-call availability is actually bucking national trend. It's now starting to go back up again. So it's the retention key that's critical. And recruitment-wise, just to answer the question on recruitment, it's about not doing what we've always done. We're trying different things. So not just locally led recruitment and an employer-led recruitment, but like family appreciation days and nurturing that goodwill, bringing that goodwill back into those stations, quite often of which is already there. And the word spreads and people want to be part of that team. I'll just give you a quick story on this. So I've got a retained station. I won't name because I don't want to embarrass them. Glynneath. Let's just go straight in. Glynneath Fire Station. Okay. So Andrew Vaughan there is the watch manager, and they were down to like 6 or 7 people and really struggling. And they were keeping the pump on the run way more than what they should have done with 6 or 7 people. That commitment was huge. And supported by their kind of cluster station manager, they really focused really hard on recruiting locally, getting into the employers, getting leaflets out there, doing community engagement events to bring people into the station. And over a 12-month period, they upped their establishment from about 5 or 6 up to 13, and now they've got a waiting list. And that goes to show that even when an on-call is really on its knees, that station was on its knees. With that support, with that strategic intent, with that focused energy, it was able to turn it around. And that's the leadership locally with Andrew and with Lev and the others. And they've done an amazing job. So, yeah, I think you need to keep doing that. You need to keep the traction on both the retention piece and the recruitment piece.
Yes, that local is the calling again. You talked about community calling, but I want to say those individuals want caring so much that they went out and did all of that work. I wonder, actually, do you also have families that there's generations of firefighters? You mentioned somebody earlier who had 42 years experience, but are you getting like families, so the parents, the children? Does that happen? Does it come through the ages as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the bit that warms your cockles of your heart type of thing, doesn't it? I mean, so last year I went up to a retirement function in Ryder, or as I call it, the Republic of Ryder. They've got their own way of doing things in Ryder. It's brilliant. They're really embedded in their community and are well known in their community. So when I went up there for the retirement do, and this just plays to this multi-generational thing, Selwyn was there, Selwyn James. Now, Selwyn was the watch manager, sub-officer as it was back in the day. His father, Ernie, was one of the original sub-officers for the first ever Ryder fire station. And it was his son, Selwyn, that took over from him. His son, Andrew, took over from him. I'd gone to Andrew's retirement due about 4 or 5 years ago. He retired during COVID. And I was actually going to his brother's retirement due, David. And David's son, Cameron, is currently serving there as well. So that, you talk about, Ernie was there during the war. He was riding around on his motorbike, keeping a watch out when the fire station was in a different location. And what I actually did was I took an application form over because Cameron's daughter was only like 9 months old or something. And we tried to get her to sign up in readiness for when she turned 18. So it's a really heartwarming thing when you see that multi-generational theme, that commitment to that community.
Yes, that's 4 generations you talked about there. It makes me think of some kind of Sunday night drama that we might be able to put them on TV to talk about it. So one thing that you've done within your service is introduce a new pay and availability banding system. What difference has that made to your on-call cadre and bringing new people in?
Yeah, so that was an NJC negotiated pay and terms arrangements deal, call it what you will. That came in, I believe it was January of last year on the back of the negotiated settlements. And I'll be honest with you, there's a real apprehension at the time when it came in because the evidence, again, when you look at the evidence that's out there, especially from Dr. Steve Sadler and the new national research, is that when you've got bans, there's almost like this kind of race to the bottom. So you've got to be careful that people all of a sudden, instead of covering, say, 90 hours, all of a sudden now only cover 30 hours. And you've got to be careful how you manage it. But we've not seen a drop in availability since the implementation of the bans. And I think what we've seen is a more flexible approach. And I'm hoping over the next few years, we'll see an opportunity to perhaps to diversify. So for people that can only give 30 to 60 hours a week, still valuable time, but recognizing we might attract a slightly different demographic or we might attract a certain different kind of workforce into it. And that is still yet to be seen. But I think the idea behind it was bringing some flexibility around pay and contracts. What I will say, Catherine, is, when you look at on-call, other than having a retainer that they have for kind of tending drill periods and being on call, they only get paid when they actually go out on calls as well. So it's almost like a pay-as-you-go scheme. So there's not an awful lot of money that they're earning here at all. It is very much about that community focus, that community spirit there. So I think the bans have enabled flexibility. I think they'll enable much more, but the reward of putting those bans in I think it's still a little bit too early to tell.
Okay, so that's happening at a national level. Is that something that was started in England? Because obviously you're in Wales, so is that a national system? Can you just help me understand that? Yeah,
so the Grey Book Terms and Conditions, I think we're on the 6th edition, so it's enshrined within the negotiated terms and conditions from the unions and the employers. And that was something they said that years ago, the contracts were 100%, which was 120 hours a week. And for listeners, there's only 168 hours in the week. So 120 hours a call is quite a substantial amount. Or there was a 75% contract, which was notionally, I guess, for 90 hours, but anything under 120. So what the pay bands that were brought in at national level enabled people to do was to put in place some pay bands that would look at different kind of levels of availability. What I will say is a number of fire and rescue services prior to this coming in January 25 had instigated their own banding systems. But as I said, I think it's quite a spectrum, a broad range of how successful those had been. So when they did it at national level, there was a real worry, but I don't think that worry necessarily has been borne out.
Okay. And looking at gender within your on-call workforce, what's the balance like?
So across the operational firefighter, all uniforms, if you like, we're running about 8 to 9%, depending on leavers and starters. I guess from a flexibility perspective, this is what I was talking to you about earlier on. I think with the flexibility of offering up to 30 hours, offering up to 60 hours, we are kind of casting our net out wider. You know, you don't have to do 90 to 100 hours these days to be able to have an on-call contract. Actually, we value 30 and 60 hours, that work-life balance. And so I feel we can probably diversify our offering a bit more to make ourselves more attractive. The other thing with that then, regardless of diversity, is about individuals' contribution to availability. So Lancashire were the first ones to introduce it, and I think we've been hot on their heels. There's a new software system out there that we've been using that if you joined, Catherine, today, one of our on-call stations, and you looked at your hours of availability, we'd be able to say, if you joined, how much more availability, how many more calls we'd likely be able to attend if you came and joined as well. So, yeah, there's more work evolving, more targeted approach. But I'd go back to, I think, flexibility in contracts will hopefully help us with some of those diversity challenges that we've got.
Tell me a bit more about that software. So what happens? You plug in someone's availability and it tells you what difference it will make in terms of the response you can give to the public. Is that what you said?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, I don't think I can endorse, and I won't mention the name because I'm sure there's lots of software systems out there, but imagine a software system now. So you're an established on-call firefighter in my local station, Tumble, for example, now, and there's 3 of you that want to become a driver. And I can then use the software to identify which one of you will give most availability for Tumble, and therefore how many more calls we're likely to attend if I put you on the driving course as opposed to the other 2. So it's the same kind of thing. So if you walked in through the door as a new recruit and you offered some hours of availability, we'd be able to see straight away what your net contribution would be to keeping that pump on the run based upon everybody else's contract that's on the systems. It's a really intelligent data evidence approach to making sure. And the other thing that it gives us is, say now you're doing 90 hours a week and you want to drop your hours because you've got family commitments or caring commitments, or you just need to reshape things a little bit. It enables us to look at the system and say, well, actually, Catherine, if you want to drop some hours, how about if you drop them from here or drop them from there without affecting the availability of the pump as well? So yeah, we're just getting smarter and more intelligent in terms of our on-call availability piece.
That's really interesting. I hadn't really thought to talk to you about data and technology with on-call, but actually that sounds absolutely vital in terms of making the most of the precious resources that you have, these people who are doing it outside of their normal job and contributing in the most efficient, effective way for you to deliver back to that community. Are you the only service that does that, or is that quite common across on-call, other fire services which have on-call elements?
I wouldn't say it's common. As I said, Lancashire led the way. They co-developed this offering with a commercial partner, and we just jumped on the bandwagon of it because you could see when you look, we've been asking for this for years, if that makes sense. So my understanding, well, we've signed up to it. I think we've had it in now for maybe 6 or 9 months or something like that. I think other services are coming on board with it. But if, like we've got apps for everything these days, haven't we? We've got apps for absolutely everything. So why wouldn't we have a system that can intelligently tell us when somebody walks through the door, or if you need a new driver, or you want BAs, or you want specialist skill sets, who would be able to give you best coverage? So I think some services have tried to replicate it. I think the issue sometimes with services trying to replicate that kind of stuff is you'll only get your in-house viewpoint on it. And I think sometimes it is worth spending the money with a commercial partner to create a system that it's not just helping 1 or 2 services, it helps quite a few.
So as we come to the end of our conversation, given everything that we've talked about in terms of the jobs that they do, where people come from, the challenges it faces for them personally, for their employers, things about pay, flexibility, the risk there's changes, and all that data we've just talked about. Are you optimistic about the future of on-call in the fire service?
Absolutely. Not just optimistic, but as I said, here in Mid and West, I think we've been in a really fortunate enough position that we've had the strategic intent from our fire authority, and they've supported that with investment. And you've got a senior team that's invested in sustaining and making that on-call system better. And I think when you get the mixture of both, the art of the possible is at your fingertips. So I am optimistic. I think we are now seeing a number of services who put in that strategic intent and that focus in. I'm not saying it's the same everywhere. Different services have got different challenges and different pressures, and I absolutely respect that and get that. So I'm only speaking from a Mid and West perspective. But availability has started increasing. Our job is to maintain that traction, maintain that focus, and I guess fundamentally nurturing and supporting that goodwill which is in bucket loads out there.
That part of the interview where Craig talks about personal sacrifice and how this is a calling for some people really struck me as getting to the heart of what makes someone become an on-call firefighter. I went into this conversation thinking that it might be all doom and gloom, and that the system that relies on local community volunteers, albeit with some payment, was on its knees and dying out as the world has moved on. And I was wrong. There is innovation in approaches to pay and to the use of technology and data. And I was really interested in the software they're using to work out the impact of changing the availability of one individual on the service that one fire station can provide to its local area. So much so that I found the developers, a firm called ORH, at a conference the week after my interview and took a closer look. Craig's optimism and depth of caring about the people who work for his service is palpable. Note how easily he reeled off the names of people in remote fire stations, generations who have made on-call firefighting a family tradition. It's no wonder he is chief today. Nurture the goodwill, he tells me, because it's there in bucket loads, and it looks like that's working for him as the on-call availability continues to rise. So my thanks to Craig for taking time to talk to me about on-call firefighting. So that's it from me for now. Episodes of this series drop every Tuesday. All our podcast episodes are sponsored by MSA Safety, and we're so grateful to them for their support. Be sure to share, like, and if you haven't already, subscribe to For Every Response, the podcast from Emergency Services Times.